Hello, Peter.
Oh, now I can see people. Exciting.
Dear colleagues and friends, tonight we deal with the topic fundamental to core syntax, which has been investigated quite deeply in recent times. It's linearization. Our discussants are Richard Kayne from New York University and Neeleman from University College London. Tonight's moderator is Michelle Sheehan from the Anglia Ruskin University. As usual, the two discussants will exchange ideas and give us their view in the form of a contest. And they will answer 3 questions offered by the moderator. Then we open discussion. For those of you who intend to ask questions from YouTube, please send me an email message to ceciliapoletto@gmail.com. For security reasons, the chat, microphone, and screen sharing functions have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write to everybody if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. So write to me as well if you intend to ask a question. Those of you who won't be able to ask a question can send it to me via email. I will collect the questions and then send them to the speakers for eventually a later reply. The event is being streamed on YouTube and recorded on both YouTube and WeChat. If you ask a question, you're implicitly giving your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link of the YouTube registration you have received with the flyer to students and colleagues and post it on your social media. And now I leave the floor to Michelle Sheehan for tonight's epic battle in linguistic history.
Thanks, Cecilia. Sorry, just need to unmute myself. So yeah, really excited to hear the debate this evening. What I'm going to do in the first 5 minutes is just, I guess, give a bit of the contextual background. Not that you can really do this in 5 minutes, but I think it's interesting to remember that word order has not really always been of much interest to linguists, actually. So while writing an introduction to a book, me and Teresa Bibra researched this quite a bit, and it was interesting to see that when you look at kind of ancient grammarians talking about word order, they're kind of interested in it only in as much as they want to provide some kind of rationale for the order of constituents. So Priscian, for example, said very famously about Latin that the noun precedes the verb because the substance expressed by the noun precedes the accidents expressed by the verb. So there was this kind of desire to have a kind of a deeper reason behind word order, which I think is kind of quite different from how we think about it these days. And then this continued even into the 18th century with the Grammaire Générale tradition, where they also were kind of trying to find the natural order amongst languages and comparing different languages. Obviously, they decided that French had the natural order, but that was the kind of approach that was taken. So I guess the interest in word order and linearisation that we'll be discussing today, I would say goes back to Greenberg at least. So Greenberg was obviously a really important figure in the history of language typology and in the study of word order. And I guess when you go back to his papers from the 60s, there were sort of two really important things that he highlighted about word order. The first was that there was this general tendency towards harmony in spoken languages. And in generative approaches, this has been kind of analysed usually with the head parameter, and at least traditionally, right? So the idea was that you're either predominantly a head initial or a predominantly head final language, and that was somehow just something that very quickly entered generative grammar. And then there's been a lot of further work in typology, of course, on this, where people have proposed different kinds of functional explanations for that phenomenon. But the other important thing that Greenberg highlighted, which I'm sure will come up today in the discussions, was the existence of numerous asymmetries in the order of spoken languages. So, for example, asymmetries whereby objects behave differently from subjects, and whereby pre-modifiers behave differently from post-modifiers, and so on and so forth. And of course, he came up with a big list of word order universals, many of which are still being discussed by people like Arden and other people today, and Cinque as well. So I think it's these asymmetries that have been of most significant interest to generative grammarians like Ritchie and Arden and many of us when we think about word order and the sort of how we get from structure to linear order, basically. So within generative grammar, I just want to say a couple of things about word order, and there's so much you could say, but I guess in the 80s and 90s, the main issue that people were grappling with was how to make the head parameter compatible with the range of word orders that we found in natural languages. And one of the things that people like Lisa Travis and Hilda Kottmann and Audrey Lee did really well, I think, was to try and come up with principled reasons, principal explanations for languages that had very disharmonic word orders like Mandarin and Vata. And that I think paved the way in a way for Ritchie's work in the 90s, because they opened up this idea that often even basic word orders were actually derived by movement. So obviously Ritchie's book from 1994 kind of introduced quite a radical new perspective on all of this, with the idea that asymmetric C command mapped to precedence mediated via dominance, so that there was really a kind of a much more direct connection between hierarchical structure and linear order. And he proposed it as an axiom famously, so that we could kind of infer structure from linear order in a kind of exciting way. So this was exciting for conceptual reasons, but also I think it afforded a potential explanation for many striking asymmetries of spoken languages. Some of the kinds of things that Greenberg had mentioned, but also other things, such as the fact that there were no verb penultimate conditions, and there was no predominantly we found leftward movement in spoken languages. So this led to, of course, many important ideas within generative grammar, including the cartographic approach, arguably, that has been so important in many places. And then on the other hand, we've got today Neeleman talking, and Ada's also done a lot of work on word orders and grappling with unusual, strange alternations that we find with particle-verb constructions and things like that. But I guess most recently his work with Klaus Abels has been really interesting in that he's been kind of contrasting a symmetric view of syntax involving head parameter with the kind of asymmetric or anti-symmetric approach. And I guess that work it will be interesting, the discussion tonight, because what he's pointed out in some of that work is that despite the conceptual appeal of the LCA, it turns out to be not as restrictive as it first seems when you actually start to use it. So that actually what he's proposed in some of his work is that word order asymmetries really boil down mainly to the restriction on that movement needs to be to the left. And so that could be something that we could be handled by parsing potentially, so that we could kind of maybe do without the LCA in languages. So that was basically what I wanted to say. I think I'm out of time anyway. So I think without further ado, we will go to the questions. So the first question that the two discussants have been asked to respond to is the following: is precedence a relation defined in core syntax or only at the externalisation interface? So Ard, if you can answer that question first, please.
I don't know, but I'll try to explain why I think I don't know. So I know where my heart is. I would like it to be the case that linear order only comes in at the interface, and that the syntax doesn't refer to it. Well, let's take a few steps back. So I'd like to begin actually by pointing out some agreements. One agreement is that we live in an asymmetric linguistic universe, if I may quote Rich on that. That is to say, syntax seems to abound with asymmetries that need to be accounted for, like, the direction of the WH movement and the position of the subject with respect to the predicate and so on. And so the dispute is really where this asymmetry comes from. And that you can ask in two ways. So one way to ask that is to ask whether that's a property of phrase structure, which is Kayne's view, or whether that's a property of certain syntactic dependency, which is essentially the view that Klaus and I and other people as well argued for. So that's one way to ask the question. The other question is this syntax or is this PF? I think I would like it to be PF, and for certain aspects of the problem, it could well be an interface, that linear order is introduced at the interface, namely, whenever you're trying to order sisters, it's quite easy to do that using the interface. But on the view that we're developing, a lot of the asymmetries have to do with syntactic dependencies. And there it's much less clear that you can do that using interface rules, partly because you need to make adjustments to your syntax to allow, these syntactic dependencies can of course span large distances, and it's not obvious that all of that is visible to PF. Now that can perhaps be repaired by making use of a kind of slash features, for instance, for movement, where you inherit movement properties so that you can make them locally available and then do the ordering locally. Whether that's possible for all dependencies that seem to be linearly constrained, that's not so clear. I'd like to briefly show two sets of data that make me wonder whether it's possible to maintain that linear order is introduced at PF. I'll need to share a screen. I'm sorry about that. I was advised not to share screens, but I'll do it anyways. Okay, I hope something's happening. Yeah. So here's one set of data from Williams 97. This is data that illustrates what he calls the general, well, I can't know. Anyways, it's a general constraint on anaphoric dependencies, GPAD, I can't remember what the, anyways. The observation is that it's stated there that anaphoric dependencies are listed whenever either a structural constraint holds or a linear constraint holds. So either the antecedent has to precede, or the antecedent has to be located in a higher clause. That's essentially, William gives a bunch of data from different types of anaphoric dependencies that all meet that condition. And it seems to me that it's very hard to see how that could work if things are purely done at the PF interface, because it looks here as if a structural constraint and a linear constraint are alternatives to each other. Either you must meet the linear constraint or you must meet the structural constraint. You can meet both, but you cannot meet neither. That seems to me a very hard problem if you want to maintain that it's all done at the interface. A second issue is to do with dislocations of CP. So these are data from a recent paper by Bruning and Al-Khalaf in Linguistic Inquiry. And the general observation is that CPs can be fronted as long as the selecting verb selects a DP rather than a CP. And CPs can be extraposed as long as the selecting verb selects a CP rather than a DP. So there's a contrast between the first data set you see there, where the first example is bad, the fronting example, and the second pair of examples where the extraposition is bad. Now, this again seems to me something that's quite hard to explain if everything is PF, because the difference between these two structures is presumably to do with a syntax that has no phonological reflex. So perhaps, you know, when the CP is fronted from a DP position, what you're actually fronting is a null operator. Or perhaps there is some null head that is combined with the CP to make it a DP under exceptional circumstances. However that may be, that stuff is empty. And if the whole thing is done at PF, then empty stuff should not really count. So it seems to me overall that I know what I like, but I don't think what I like is going to be true given these kinds of data, unless I overlook something. I forgot to press my stopwatch. I have no idea how much time I've spent.
Good, yeah, that's about 5 minutes. So yeah, thanks
All
very
right.
much.
Okay.
So Richie, if you'd like to answer the first question as well. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, better? I was trying to say that odd has just convinced me that PF is not where it is. But I'd already believed that for various reasons, many of which I gave in a paper that by coincidence I circulated about 3 days ago. I'll just mention some of them. One has to do with the status of the LCA, which in the 1994 monograph I took to be an axiom as its name indicated. But in more recent work, I've tried to think about the question of how we might take it to be a theorem rather than an axiom and try to get a deeper account of word order facts. And I convinced myself in agreement with at least some of Odd's remarks, that to do that, you had to take linear order to be part of core syntax. If you take linear order to come in only through externalization in Chomsky's sense, then as far as I could see, you had no hope of accounting for the anti-symmetric aspects of syntax that I've been interested in. Now, Chomsky, of course, has given arguments, tried to give arguments in favor of his view that linear order is not part of core syntax. In this recent paper, I tried to argue against at least some of them. One point he makes is that linear order seems not to make any contribution to semantic interpretation. And that's arguably true, but from the perspective of anti-symmetry, that's not surprising because linear order has no independent existence in a certain sense, since it follows from hierarchical structures. So you wouldn't expect to find semantic effects attributable only to linear order. A second point that Chomsky makes is the one that he's made for many years now concerning operations like subject-aux inversion in English, where it's clear that if you have an auxiliary embedded within a relative clause embedded within a subject, the operation can't pick that one, even though it's linearly closer to the composition that it's aiming for. But I tried to show in this paper that that might be an island effect. If you pick your island effects carefully, looking at extraction, not of arguments, but of non-arguments, you get the same effect with, say, adverb extraction as you do with subject-aux inversion, even in cases where there's no other adverb at issue, and even in cases of parasitic gaps. That is, not only can't you move the auxiliary out of its embedded position within the subject alone, but you can't even do it if you do it as a parasitic gap operation. Another point that Chomsky makes is that syntax doesn't seem to count. And he says, well, if you have linear order, why couldn't you have an operation that says, thinking of some of Andrea Moro's work, that some language puts negation after the third word in a sentence? And I agree completely that that's not ever likely to be found. But it's worth noting that structural conditions don't count either, I think. That is, no syntactic operation says pick the phrase that corresponds to the third or fourth node down from some other point in the structure. Or no syntactic operation says pick the third closest phrase and move it to the front of the sentence. Now, if that's true, it means that the language faculty is shying away strongly from counting in the formulation of its operations in a way that seems to me arguably independent of the question of where linear order is. Another factor that Chomsky has actually been hesitant about is whether or not movement operations can fail to feed semantic interpretation. I mean, if they fail to, that's a bit surprising from his general perspective, because his general perspective is that semantic interpretation should pay attention to everything that's there. And since there seem to be syntactic operations that are semantically neutral, that's a potential problem. I think in general, this is, I'm losing track of how much time I have left. In general, this is related to Chomsky's old idea going back to the 80s of what he called full interpretation. That is the idea that everything that's in the syntactic representation that's fed into the semantics has to be taken into account. And I think the correctness of full interpretation is an important question relative to all of this. And let me just finish on one point that I don't think anybody has tried to come to terms with, and that is, what is the effect on the plausibility of full interpretation of the existence of thousands and thousands of idioms, which by definition don't have form that doesn't fully feed into semantic interpretation. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. So a little bit of agreement there on in the first question. The second question is Richie's going to answer first, which is there an underlying universal head initial order?
Well, that question is too easy. The answer is yes, if the word underlying is not the ideal word. The position that I took in the anti-symmetry monograph and that I still take is that syntax has a consistent orientation, in particular spec-head complement, that cuts across all aspects of structure at every single stage of the derivation. So it's not at all a claim about underlying in the sense of derivation initial. It's this claim about everything all the time. Now, I've thought that for a long time, in large part, because of asymmetries, as Odd mentioned, asymmetries that everybody knows about. In syntax, the first one that I actually paid attention to, I think, and you can see this in the 1989 paper of mine on null subjects in clitic climbing, was the fact that object clitics in Romance language are invariably to the left of a finite verb, never to its right. Now, the fact that that's actually not 100% true is something that I didn't know at the time. I know it now on the basis of Cristina Tortoro's work on Borgo Manerese, but I don't think it changes anything. There are a lot of asymmetries like that. And the work I've done in the line, starting with the anti-symmetry monograph, represents an attempt to essentially account for the whole class of such asymmetries in terms of a single proposal, namely the core anti-symmetry proposal. In this recent paper from 3 days ago, I give a number of particular asymmetries. Let me just run through some of them quickly. I don't think that people who, for one reason or another, don't want to adopt anti-symmetry, I don't think that they have been looked at. I don't think that people have come to grips with them sufficiently. I don't think that enough, except for the notable cross-linguistic work done by Greenberg and Cinque and Neeleman and Novels, et cetera, on the DP internal order. I think in a lot of these cases, people have shied away from working on the cross-linguistics of things. One very simple one that goes back to work by Kayne and by Downing in the 70s and 80s is the asymmetry between pre-nominal and post-nominal relative clauses, which from a symmetric perspective should differ solely in their order relative to the noun. But in fact, as Downing and then later Kayne pointed out, they differ in other ways, in particular, whether or not you can have a relative pronoun, which basically you can in post-nominal relative clauses, but not in pre-nominal. Also, pre-nominal relative clauses tend strongly to be non-finite, and that's not true of post-nominal. I tried to give an account of this in the anti-symmetry monograph, which of course can be worked on further. There are similar facts one can note about coordination. In this recent paper, I tried to give a series of reasons to think, in particular, in the spirit of the book by Johannesson from the mid-90s on what she called unbalanced coordination, that coordination is basically asymmetric, intrinsically asymmetric, in a way that fits into anti-symmetry. There are also all sorts of asymmetries concerning adverbs, which don't act the same in VO context as they do in OV contexts. And we should keep in mind in all these cases that we're not talking about properties of languages. We're talking about properties of structures, so that you can have a single language that has both, let's say, in the case of adverbs, both OV and VO, or a single language that has both aux V and V aux. And within that language, you'll see these asymmetries. Another one has to do, which is Odd touched on, going back to work by Edwin Williams, concerning the antecedent pronoun relation and the old discussion going back to the 1960s about what was called backwards pronominalization as opposed to what was called forwards pronominalization. Those terms pick out cases in which the antecedent of a given pronoun does not C-command the pronoun. And in languages like English, English is very generous with those. It allows both kinds of cases, backwards and forwards pronominalization, without much difficulty. And I think it's rather interesting to think that that fact about English was, I think, a key fact feeding into Lasnik's 1976 paper, in which he took pronouns to be able to take antecedents freely, subject only to, in essence, conditions B and C of the binding theory. And so it's rather important, I think, and I don't think anywhere near as much attention has been paid to this as should be paid to it, that English is not representative when it comes to backwards pronominalization. For example, apparently, according to Michel de Graaf, there is none whatsoever in Haitian Creole. Jim Huang indicated that Chinese has much less backwards pronominalization than English. Colette Craig, in her grammar of Hakaltek, says that Hakaltek has none at all. Perhaps particularly surprisingly, there's a grammar of Danish by Allen and a couple of other authors. And that grammar of Danish says that Danish has either none or at least much less backward pronominalization than English. Thraunsen and some co-authors say something essentially the same about Faroese. Jayashilan says about Malayalam that some speakers of Malayalam don't allow backward pronominalization at all. Now, the interesting point here is that there don't seem to be cases of languages which turn their back on forwards pronominalization in the way that the 5 or 6 or 7 languages I just mentioned turn their back on backwards pronominalization. That's a major asymmetry that bears very directly on everything we've been talking about. And as Odd emphasized, it's a particularly thorny kind of asymmetry for the idea that precedence doesn't come in until externalization. I should probably stop there. I imagine I've gone over time. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Ad, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. So the most important argument for the view that syntax is not asymmetric is to appear in a paper that I'll publish in 3 days, but I'll refrain from discussing that. That paper says that coordination is in fact symmetrical and sometimes more than binary branching. But anyways, we'll skip that. So the argument against the LCA from earlier work that I've done with Klaus and with Peter Akema is in 2 parts, really. One part is really an observation that as things stand, there is an asymmetric and anti-symmetric representation for every symmetric, an LCA compatible representation for every representation that you can build in a symmetric framework, unless you add things to the theory, and those things are not always there, or in many cases they're not there. And moreover, those 2 representations, the symmetric and the anti-symmetric representation, are very, very similar in their gross constituency. We made a paper where we try to show that in terms of an algorithm that shrinks trees from the anti-symmetric trees to the symmetric trees, or blows them up from the other direction. So that makes it quite hard to find empirical evidence one way or another. In that earlier paper, we tried to give some evidence based on difficulties with movement. For example, requirement to get in the universal 20 paradigm to get the noun demonstrative adjective numeral order by stranding material that was piped in the first step of movement. And that requires a looser theory of movement than you perhaps want, partly because it can then, it's then possible to generate orders where some constituent following ahead come in an ascending order and some come in a descending order, and they're kind of interleaved. That's probably something you don't want to allow. So that worked. There's some other arguments there. I want to talk about some stuff that I've done more recently that tries to develop a different kind of argument. I'm afraid I'm going to have to share a screen to do this. Right, there we go. So this is based on the language spoken in Paradise, Dutch. And the crucial element in this particular argument is temporal only. And temporal only is the only you see in the English example on this slide. If Kim only found a solution on Sunday, that doesn't mean that Kim found a solution on Sunday and no other day of the week. It means that Sunday was late for Kim to find a solution. It has a kind of temporal interpretation. And Dutch has a specific particle to express that temporal interpretation. It's pas, as you can see in the second block of examples. And there's a simple generalization over the distribution of pas. When pas is pre-verbal, it cannot be separated by any constituent from the temporal expression it's associated with. So, for example, the second Dutch example on the handout is ungrammatical. But pas can be separated by VP, as you can see in that final example on this slide. Okay, this is all the Dutch you need to know for this argument. All right, so, well, not quite, but almost all the Dutch. How do we get these PPs following the verb in an OV language? Well, on the symmetric theory, one important observation there is that there is a mirror image effect. That's what you can see on the example here. And that mirror image effect can either be explained using, let's say, Bayes generation, as in the first tree you see there, the Christmas tree, or it can be done by roll-up movement, as you can see in the second tree, right? Okay, so the second tree is the anti-symmetric version of the anti-symmetric account. The first is the symmetric account. Now, the simple paradigm of those three sentences that I gave can, I think, not be accounted for using anti-symmetry. So these are the ungrammatical structures on the two theories. So the thing to notice here is that pas must be very close to the PP it associates with. And in fact, Barbiers, who gave the first full description of these data, says that pas must immediately C-command the category that acts as its semantic argument. So that's the PP in this case. So that's not the case in either tree, right? In the tree in A, the XP, some XP intervenes. That might be some adverbial, for example, and that's ungrammatical. And then in the second tree, that same adverbial intervenes. And again, there's no immediate C command. But now let's look at the case where VP intervenes between pas and the PP. That is on the anti-symmetric theory, the same tree, by and large. That is to say, VP has fronted under a roll-up movement to a position between pas and the PP. And so I'll flip back and forth to between the two representations. These two representations in A are the same. It's going to be very hard to explain why one of them is grammatical and the other is ungrammatical. On the other hand, the two smaller representations, the symmetric representations, are different. So in this representation, there is an element that intervenes between pos and xp and the pp, namely the xp. That's where the adverbial sits. But in the case that the pp appears post-verbally, there's nothing that intervenes. There's a vp there, but that's not an intervener in the same sense that this xp is an intervener in the tree in B. Okay. All right. I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop here.
Great. So, okay, the final question for both of you, and I think that Ada's going to answer this one first, is given your model, how is a phenomenon like extraposition analysed?
Right. I'm going to share the screen immediately. Right. So I'd like to. Extraposition is not one thing, so I don't think I can give a general answer for all types of extraposition. But I'd like to suggest that there's at least one kind of extraposition in which the category that extraposed is in a higher position than it would normally be, and obviously to the right, so that there's some upward displacement. The argument for that comes from various data. I first want to draw attention to this paper by Overveld from 2015, in which it is argued that our generalization about heavy MP shift was actually wrong. That it's not true that heavy MP shift is very local in any general sense, but that every instance of heavy MP shift that goes beyond the local domain that we're familiar with requires a parasitic gap in the material that it crosses, or multiple parasitic gaps. For every constituent it crosses, I think the claim is there must be a parasitic gap. So that's shown in the first block of data. And the second set of data show that actually the extraposition can take you quite high, can take you into a matrix clause from an embedded clause. So it's not as local as you might think. Now, okay, so this looks like rightward movement to a higher position, and Overveld carefully controls for the possibility that we're dealing with right node raising, which he argues against. The thing to notice here is the order of the adverbials between the trace of heavy MP shift and the shifted MP, because it turns out that the higher of the two adverbials follows the lower of the two adverbials. On any theory that I'm aware of, that must mean that heavy MP shift leads to something that's higher in the tree, either by roll of movement, which I've just argued against, or by direct rightward movements. And I think this property is more general, so I've just published a paper on PP extraposition in English, which looks at two possible analyses. One is an analysis in which the PP shifts to the right to a higher position where it would normally be. And the other is an analysis in which there's verb raising, and the adverbials between the verb and the PP are crossed by verb raising, or at least that's one of the possibilities. Now, these two analyses differ in the order of the adverbials. So on the first analysis, the extraposition analysis, the low adverbial must precede the high adverbial, whereas on the verb raising analysis, adverbials between verb and the PP must come in the order high adverbial, low adverbial. Assuming this is a bit of a simplification, that's the only possible derivation. Okay, so the evidence is, I think, that quite generally the low adverbial must precede the high adverbial. So that's true for temporal adverbials. So this is, we carried out several online experiments to figure out what exactly the data are, and the results are given in that table here. I'll spare you all the statistical talk around it, but the upshot is that there is a clear preference among speakers for a constant adverbial order, no matter where the PP is, namely with the manner adverbial preceding the temporal adverbial. And that suggests that if the PP is extraposed, it ends up in a higher position than where you think it might be. So this is for manner and temporal adverbials. Now, there's a famous set of data from an unpublished paper by Bezetsky, in which it's argued that actually the order of adverbials in an example where two of these adverbials intervene between a verb and a PP that's extraposed, the order of the adverbials is variable. The higher can precede the lower, or the lower can precede the higher. That's the final example in the first block. But it turns out that that's true exactly in the case where the two adverbials jointly can be clefted and therefore look like they might be a constituent. There's also some interpretive evidence that might suggest that they are constituents. The interpretation is not the same in the case that they're clefted. Anyways. But only some adverbials can do that. So there's a contrast, as you can see, between again and a second time in the extent to which these elements can be clefted along with continuously. It says 10 out of 10 and 0 out of 10. That's just a poll with native speaker linguists in these orders. So here's the result of a second experiment that looks at the order of the adverbials. These two lower adverbials, and you see exactly the same effect when you don't get again, but at the second time you see it's the same effect as a constant preference in which the lower of the two adverbials precedes the higher of the two adverbials, confirming that when the PP shifts, it shifts to a higher position. That's it. Look. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So the final response from Richie, and then we'll open the discussion.
Can you hear me? In thinking about extraposition for the purposes of this discussion, I actually had forgotten about heavy and P-shift. And so I'm grateful to Odd for reminding me that it fits into the general question. So let me make a few remarks about heavy and P-shift. I mean, obviously there are some very specific technical questions. Needless to say, I'm favorable to the kind of analysis that Richard Larson initiated back in the late 80s and that Marcel Dane-Dicken modified subsequently, whereby heavy and P-shift is an effective leftward movement of the argument in question, plus some further verb phrase like movement. But let's take that to be a technical question and focus for a second on two more basic, what I would take to be more basic questions. One familiar one that at least was discussed back in the 60s is what do we mean by heavy? But I think the most important question is actually not that one, but rather the question, why should heaviness, however it's defined, ever make a difference in any syntactic operation? It's completely off by itself. I mean, heavy and P-shift is a crazy operation. I think the answer has to do with extraposition indirectly. I think for extraposition also, one can ask why it exists. I mean, extraposition of the familiar type, several, as Odd mentioned, the various subtypes, relative clause extraposition, comparative clause, consecutive clause, and then ordinary, apparently ordinary sentential extraposition. I think that one question that is worth asking is, it's the kind of question that was asked in a different way by Joe Emmons a long time ago, I think, and that is, why should we think in terms of extraposition rather than in terms of a reverse operation or combination of operations that we might call intraposition? And nowadays, I think we can reformulate that question, let's say in the case of relative clause extraposition, by asking, why is it that we think that there's something special about relative clause extraposition? Special in the sense that we think that it's derived by an extra syntactic operation compared to the ordinary case in which you have a relative clause that has not been extraposed. The alternative would be to think that extraposition comes automatically. It's not something that has to be thought of in terms of an extra syntactic operation that languages could just as well do without. Rather, it comes about automatically because relative clauses, let me continue with relative clauses, because relative clauses are not put together in the way that we think they are. I mean, in part they are, but not completely. And this is a proposal that I made somewhere in the past. The idea was to say that much as in the case of prepositions, which I've argued to be introduced VP externally, not to be externally merged with what we think of as their object, but to come together with what we think of as their object via internal merge. And I made a proposal to the same effect with relative clauses. I had the idea that you had a relative clause structure with a relative clause and then the head that was extracted from it from my perspective. But then I had the idea that there's, in addition, there has to be a complementizer-like element that comes in above the verb phrase and that has the effect of attracting the relative clause proper. Once it does that, the relative clause proper and its so-called head are forever distinct. They, after that point in the derivation, they never form a constituent with each other. And I still think that that's an interesting way of trying to think about the properties of relative clause extraposition, and by extension, about the properties of ordinary, what we think of as ordinary sentential extraposition, insofar as, if I'm right in other work, ordinary sentential complements are actually relative clauses in a sense that goes back to the work by Peter Rosenbaum in the 1960s. One sort of orthogonal point, but it's an important point relative to all this, is to what extent do relative clauses look like they're part of ordinary syntax? You know, can you extract out of them? And in a lot of languages, the answer is no. But as Taraldsen noted in an important article a long time ago, in Norwegian, you can readily extract out of extraposed relative clauses. In English, you can also, to some extent, as Chung and McCluskey noted in a squib, I think it was, in Linguistic Inquiry somewhat after that. So in that sense, it's clear that, to me, that relative clause, what we call relative clause extraposition, is just part of ordinary syntax. Coming back as a last remark on heavy and P shift, one thing that's been much talked about is the restriction on doing heavy and P shift to the object of a preposition. And the standard view for English is that you can't do it. I think that's not quite right. For me, for my English, you can do it to some degree. But that's only true if the prepositional phrase in question is not separated from the verb by a direct object. If it is, then there's a stronger prohibition. I think indirectly that supports the kind of analysis that Larson and Denikin had in mind, but I'll stop there.
Great, thanks very much. So we've run over slightly the time that we're supposed to take, but if people want to start asking questions in the chat, I think we'll start with a question that's come in from Cristiano Chiesi who's watching on YouTube, which I'll just read to you if that's okay. So it's for both of you. And he says, don't you think that incrementality is related in a relevant way to word order? I'm thinking both about phases and semantic compositionality, and I'd like to hear your opinion on something alternative with respect to Fox and Pozetsky's cyclic linearization idea. It's complex, complex question. Any volunteers to go first?
I'm not sure I understand what incrementality means as opposed to successive applications merge.
Yeah, I think he's talking about phases. Well, he says something about phases and semantic compositionality. I'd like to hear, I think he's talking about cyclic linearization and the idea that you can kind of add additional word order linearization commands, I think, to existing ones. I think that's what he means by incrementality, right?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. Cyclic linearization has something in common with Chomsky's externalization, but not quite. I don't have a strong feeling about it.
Okay.
I mean, the same issues.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The only incrementality I dare say anything about is to do with parsing. So left to right structure building in processing or production. And yes, that in my view, that does very much determine linear order in that it's obviously true, for example, that it's easier to parse movement dependencies when you have the element that you need to insert a copy of as a trace. And it's probably also true that it's easier to interpret a pronoun if you've already seen the antecedent and you can link it to something. So, and I think actually we have a growing agreement on that particular point, because I understand that Richie Kayne also would like to use the parser to determine head complement order, if I'm not mistaken. So I think there's at least some growing consensus on that particular point.
Okay, so the next, I think Luigi Rizzi has a question. If you'd like to put your microphone on.
Yes, hi. I have a simpler question than Cristiano. It has to do with the basic character of head complement or complement head. So if you, this is for both of you, but particularly for Richie, but you may both have something to say. So if you look at some very simple systems, there seems to be a clear preference for head final order. So for instance, there is experimental work, Marina Nespor, for instance, did it. If you ask people to do a pantomime, so to express with a pantomime an event, a transitive event with two arguments and a verb, invariably people first sign one participant, then the other participant, and then sign the action. So that suggests something like what Michel was saying. I don't remember who said that, but that the substance comes before the accident, right? And some other simple systems have that property. For instance, if you look at the very interesting literature on home signing systems, the very simple systems of communication between deaf children and their parents that are made up essentially and are somewhat different in each family, still they have certain properties in common. And one very steady property is, again, head finality. So typically, you have SOV in these cases, right? So maybe this is not related to language, or maybe it is. So I just wanted to have your take on this question, considering that this would, of course, be consistent with a kind of universal base hypothesis, but with the head final choice rather than the head initial choice. So I just wanted to know if you had any comments on that.
I can say something about this. So I'm kind of with Hubert Heider on the question of OV and VO, in that the syntax of SOV is simpler on his view, and also on my view, than the syntax of SVO, in that considerations having to do with case adjacency come in SVO languages, but are largely irrelevant to SOV languages. And so on Heider's view, and by extension on my own view, it's not so surprising if SOV was the default choice, because that corresponds to the simpler syntax. The language of paradise is therefore, and so
on. As a speaker, can you hear me? As a speaker of a non-paradise language, let me answer Luigi's question by saying I would take it to indicate that there's some important preference for topicalization in language or language-like systems. I don't think it bears at all on the syntax. I mean, clearly, OV order is readily describable from my perspective or a non-anti-symmetric perspective. I don't think that there's any simple way to calculate the degree of simplicity of syntax. And I don't think it's true that there's a general lack of case adjacency effects in OV languages. There definitely is. In some of them, you may have to look at cases where the object is indefinite, or you may have to look at cases where there's no overt case marker. In any case, to me, English is extremely simple.
Right, thank you. That was a nice way to end that. We've got a question from Andrea Moro.
Yes, it's a question that probably Richie already knows because we discussed it together, but I would like to highlight what kind of expectation you both have on linearization during inner speech. And that immediately reflects on the necessity to expand the notion of externalization and whatever happens while you're not uttering a sentence.
I suspect that Chomsky would say that inner speech is an internalization of ordinary speech, and therefore that it doesn't bear on the question of externalization.
Well, the Greek had a word for that. It's a sophisma, but
I remain neutral on that question.
sorry, I have nothing to say about inner speech. I understand that there are many people who think by talking to themselves, but it's never happened to me once. So I don't know.
I think William Mochinque did you raise your hand? Yeah.
Put myself, okay. Well, thank you for the most interesting discussion. I wanted to add one consideration concerning externalization. because it seems to me, and it's also implicit in Chomsky's recent UCLA lectures, that the physics of speech would seem to allow only for two possibilities. If you take, like, say, a complement and a verb, you can either put it before or after. And so it would seem to be trivial. However, I think if you add the adjuncts and the more complex structures like the subspines that make up the macrospine, then things become less trivial in the sense that you have some generalizations that don't seem to follow from the physics of speech. For example, the left-right asymmetry, whereby more elements are found to the right than to the left, only one. Also, the fact that when you take three elements, let's say, the theoretical possibilities are 6, but you never find 6, you find 5. And that again depends on the left-right asymmetry. So if you take, for example, an adverb like always, an adverb like well, and a verb, then you get, depending on the type of verb, finite, infinitive, you can get the different possibilities, but one of them is crucially missing when you have pre-verbally well before always, for example. And also, if you take subspines, like, for example, the difference between Italian and French, when you say gli altri primi 2 giorni, in French, the head of this subspine can raise up to the front of the subspine. And you say, les 2 autres premières journées. You cannot leave it down like in Italian. So it seems that, again, depending on substructures, what can move in the movement metaphor, it's only the head of each subspine. And that doesn't seem to follow from a simple physics of speech kind of argument. At least, I mean, and the final condition is another generalization that is hard to capture on, again, on this kind of metaphor. So I wanted to ask what you think about. I mean, I think you expressed some doubts about having everything done at PF, but I think there are, I don't know, a number of considerations that seem to cast doubt on having a simple way in that sense. Okay, I'll stop here.
I think that Memo and I agree to a large extent on things, but I'd like to make one point that's a challenge to everybody, I think, and that's the fact that despite the laws of physics, speech isn't necessarily completely left to right. There are cases of superimposition, after all, with tone, for example, and there's some very striking cases in, say, African languages where you get the tone of some element X that's actually pronounced on another element Y. And any theory of linear order or syntax or whatever is going to have to come up with an interesting way of talking about that. Or another way to put it is, what's the ideal way of integrating the old discussion of autosegmental phonology with syntax?
Did you want to respond to that?
Sure, yeah. I largely agree with the comments on the direction of movement. I don't think there's much disagreement between us on that. I did want to bring up something that I've been worried about somewhat, and I'm wondering whether anybody has anything to say about it. So from the universal 20 data and lots of the other data, that fall under the same generalization, you want to say that the head moves in any neutral order or a constituent containing the head. But in order to derive OV order in LCA compatible representations, it looks like you need to move the head, the object around. And it seems to be going against the generalization, what you move as the head or a constituent containing the head. Of course, you can try to have a fine-grained theory of movement that makes these things very different and then somewhat arbitrarily restrict the constraint on movement to heads, to exclude certain types of movement, let's say a movement or something like that. But I'm wondering whether there's any progress within people who work on LCA in understanding that particular problem.
Can I say something? I mean, Richie will certainly say better than me. Like, my own take to that would be to assume that the engine, or what you start out with, is the head of the macro projection. So it's the V or VP or the NP, and everything is piled up on top of that, which comes very close to what Luigi was saying. And I think it's completely compatible with antisymmetry, if I'm not wrong, in the sense that you still have you can still think of a specifier head complement up to the last element in the structure. So what is crucial is that nothing in this, from this point of view, is merged to the right. But whatever you find to the right, at least under my take, but it's only a function of how you move the head of the macro structure. So that you don't have, otherwise you might expect languages to differ as to the mirror image and the direct order of elements. I don't know if it's me or, so that you can have, like, say, manner, locative, temporal in the mirror image, like in English, or you might have it to the right, the opposite. But I think that the two possibilities there are a function of the way you move. So I think there is still a possibility with antisymmetry to deal with the problem that you raised. I don't know, I mean, Richie will say something more deep about that.
I want to say that there are some types of languages in which it's completely clear that objects move in the derivation of canonical word order. For example, languages that you could describe as being OXD languages. For example, those languages discussed by Matthew Dreyer a long time ago, that have as their canonical order, when there's negation in the sentence, object, negation, verb. Obviously, the object has moved, and there are various other subtypes. There's one thing that came up quickly in this discussion. I should say that anti-symmetry by itself does not impose object movement, even in OV languages, because there's this common assumption that anti-symmetry yields SVO, but that's not correct. Spec head complement yields SVO only if objects are complements of verbs. But we know perfectly well from the small clause tradition, and in particular from Richard Larson's VP shells, for at least a certain subcase of cases, that it's not at all clear that what we think of as a direct object is introduced as the complement of V. It could well be it's introduced as the complement, as the specifier of some V. That's an important thing to keep in mind. I mean, I tend to think that objects always move in any case, but it's important to remember that spec head complement doesn't map to SVO automatically.
It's kind of that doesn't that leave open the question why it is that assuming that objects do move, that objects move, but the constraint that we need to capture universal 20 forbids movement of anything but the head or a constituent containing the head in structures with neutral word order. That remains, it seems to me quite a serious issue. I mean, a shared issue, but nonetheless a serious question that needs to be addressed.
I agree.
I think we should take a question from let me see, Aubrey Nunes. Did you want to ask it?
Yes, I hope this isn't an off-topic question, but I have long thought that phonology must, in evolutionary terms, have evolved before, that linearization in phonology must have preceded any sort of linearization in syntax or morphology. I wonder if I can see various ways of managing that. Very sympathetic to...
gràcies, que estic amb una videoconferència.
Sorry? What? I resonated to Ard's opening remarks. I just wondered what the speakers thought about this question.
Well, I don't have any clear sense of how human language evolved, but I think that the question of linearization in phonology is of substantial importance for the question of linearization in syntax, because one, as part of the broader question that was prominent to some extent in the 1980s, and that is the question of to what extent is phonology syntactic in its properties? And I tend to think that the most interesting answer to that is that it is very syntactic in its properties, and that what we want to do is to rethink the government phonology of the 1980s in minimalist terms.
Indeed, that's precisely my direction.
Did you want to add anything?
Oh, this is beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid.
Okay, then we move to we've got two more questions, and then we'll wrap up. So the next question is from Krista Gendroy.
Hey, so I just want to bring in briefly infant language acquisition. So we know from work by Judith Gerwin and Janet Werker that 7-month-old infants bilingual infants can actually use their OV or VO language prosody to impose a grouping on an artificial grammar. So they can impose a head complement grouping if the prosody that they hear is a VO prosody, and if they hear an OV prosody, then they impose a complement head grouping on an artificial grammar. So at 7 months, they are clearly capable of treating head complement and complement head orders. So my question is, does that imply that they already have syntactic movement? Or another way of putting the question is, this is at 7 months old. So maybe if you push the time back and we go to, let's say, newborns, do we expect, under the antisymmetric view, do we expect a preference for a VO grouping from infants? Is there an age when we would see an antisymmetry in their groupings that they impose based on prosody? Thanks.
Antisymmetry doesn't lead to a preference for VO as opposed to OV. I mean, antisymmetry is a partial theory of syntax. And if you put it together with other aspects of syntax, it clearly doesn't want to say that VO is preferable to OV in any sense. I mean, the question of extremely young children, I mean, I would think that as soon as their syntax gets going, they're respecting antisymmetry if antisymmetry is correct.
But one order involves movement and the other doesn't, right? So there is an asymmetry according to the antisymmetric view. So there may be an age before that movement is available where we would expect this then.
Well, it's not clear. I tend to think that the object moves at least once in every language. Whether or not the verb moves at least once in every language is less clear to me, but it's certainly possible that it does. So I tend to think that we actually never see, that we see many fewer things in situ than we think we do.
Unless you have anything to add, I keep saying that. Did you want to add anything to that, or shall we go to the last question?
No, let's do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so then it's Hedda Zylstra.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks to both of you. And I was wondering, in relation to the earlier made remarks on the physics of speech that might already trigger particular word order constraints or linearization constraints, and also the fact that it's not always the case that two elements must always linearly precede or follow each other. One type of languages where it is very common to utter several morphemes simultaneously are sign languages. And strikingly, sign languages are known to have a bunch of word order properties that are not found in spoken languages. For instance, WH expressions at the end of the clause. It's not really clear whether that involves cross-clause or WH dependencies, but at least clause internally, there's a variety of sign languages where WH elements end up to the right. And I'm wondering two things. A, to what extent should differences between sign and spoken languages really count as piece of evidence to saying that a linearization requirement should be outside core syntax under the assumption that in narrow terms of narrow syntax, sign and spoken languages are alike? And secondly, is there any correlation between the availability to circumvent obligatory preceding or following, the fact that two elements obligatory should follow or precede each other, whether that plays a role in terms of loosening various linearization requirements such as left-right asymmetries?
Well, I'm venturing into the unknown with that question. But it seems to me that yes, even if linear order is constrained syntactically, if there are syntactic structures in which two elements can occur at the same time, yes, that should lead to a loosening. So in that regard, I'm not sure this bears on the question whether linearization is syntactic or an interface phenomenon. It would seem to me that you get the same kind of predictions on either view.
I'm not sure that there's a black and white distinction between signed languages and spoken languages with respect to simultaneity. It could just be that signed languages are more generous. I mean, they have more options for that, but that those of us who study spoken languages, whether you only spoken or both types, have to come to grips in part with the tone phenomena that I was alluding to before, and in part with general questions about intonation, which is also superimposed on things. As far as the fact that some signed languages seem to have final WH, I don't have any particular expertise. There was one paper I remember a number of years ago in a working papers volume I think it was in Wellington, New Zealand, that argued that there was some interesting way to get around that. One thing it reminds one of is the final subjects or final topics in a language like Malagasy, which have to be analyzed. It's not clear, it's not immediately clear how to do it.
Okay. Oh, I think we've kind of run out of time. So is that right, Cecilia? Shall we?
Yes, I think we should wrap up.
Thank you. We need to wrap up. So I think we just want to thank the speakers and everyone who's asked questions and everyone who's come. And yeah, bye.
Thank you all for listening to us.
Oh yeah, you can do that. Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you, everybody. Our next flash mob is on the 3rd of December. And I wanted to remind you also of our new blog. Okay, so the next topic is binding. We have Erik Röland and Tanya Sundaresan. I hope to see you all there on the 3rd of December. Mark it down in your calendar. Goodbye.
Bye.